Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Darko Ages podcast. We're back here to talk about another team that we have some strong memories on. We're going in a little bit of a different direction, switching it up to talk about the NFL and a team that we are not fans of, but one of our Detroit Lions' bitter rivals, the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. We'll get into why we think this team is really interesting. We'll talk a little bit about, where they sat in history, what was happening in 1998. And, because we are still Lions fans, we're going to talk about what it might mean for our beloved Lions, who have a lot of striking similarities to this 1998 team. But we'll just tease that for now, and we'll get into that conversation later. Before we get started on all that, how you guys doing tonight? Any big NCAA tournament thoughts? We're on the kickoff of March Madness. Pat,
go ahead, Pat.
All he had was a go blue for you.
I'm excited.
That's all he said.
Watch the games. We got a kid from our high school is playing right now for American University, Wyatt Nausatis. He's like a backup point guard for him. So I was watching him a little bit before we popped on here to record.
What's the scouting report that you think if they win, they're going to hold the 16 seed upset over whoever they play?
Yeah, it would be Duke, and I don't think so.
Probably the TCSF connection probably not going to be enough for an American rooting with your family.
My wife will have our kids decked out in Duke. They have this thing at Duke. It's called the Iron Dukes. It's like if you give enough money, you're like special donor. You get special privileges. And Tori paid I don't know how much money. So our kids have all this swag that says Junior Iron Dukes. So they're like these little mini version of. So she's got they've got capes and hats and stickers and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, she's into it.
Yeah, there can't be a worse household combination than a Michigan man and a Duke woman. So, I mean, that's good for you guys, but just, it is what it is.
It's all kind of your fault.
It really is. It's terrible, but it is. It is. I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
So, we talked a little bit about TCSF. That's a great segue to 1998. Zach and I were freshmen at good old SF. I don't know. I don't really remember a lot about freshman year specifically. Obviously, all those high school memories kind of blend together. One thing I know for certain, Zach was rocking the purple North Face all winter long, probably into the spring. So, that's one thing we can have certainty in, that 27 years ago, he still had it.
Yeah, and to this day, I still have it.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you still rock that purple North Face.
It's a little tattered now. It is in a storage bin, though, but I'm going to break it out and have a bunch of people autograph it and frame it like a jersey.
It was definitely your iconic look, for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a picture on Facebook from ICMS. Is that it's 7th or 8th grade. So that coat's been in your life almost as long as we have.
Yeah, big time. It was my brother's before me, so it's an old jacket.
Anything else from 1998 that, Zach, you remember? Pat, you were a big man on campus at ICMS in 8th grade, right?
Yeah, actually, ICMS, wasn't there. We were at a new school, so they had just opened the C's school. We were the first 8th graders there. You guys missed out.
Yeah.
So I was at the brand new C school.
Classic elitist, class of 2003, getting all the best stuff. We had to spend our 8th grade year breathing in that asbestos. Yeah, that asbestos air at ICMS. Man, what a time, 1998. Yep. Well, let's get into some 1998 sports. The NFL in 1998. We are 14 years old in the fall of 1998. I was kind of talking to you guys. I feel like this is the peak of all of the NFL stars are larger than life era. You had, obviously, Barry Sanders in our hearts, just tearing it up for the Detroit Lions. But if you go through the passing leaders in 1998, Brett Favre, Steve Young, Peyton Manning, Dan Marino, John Elway. These are the people I think of when I think about the NFL. What do you guys think about that from that era? Are there teams that really stick out to you before we get into the Vikings specifically, or players that were always these are the big stars?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is just media consumption, not social media, obviously, in 1998, but it was peak Sports Illustrated, SI for Kids, maybe even, a few years prior. ESPN, the magazine, probably started right around that time as well, if people can remember ESPN, the magazine. Sports culture in that sense was just massive. Thinking about some of those quarterbacks you named off, those are the all-time greats as well. And what a sort of funny time to be alive where, you know, you've got these greats from the late 80s, early 90s still putting up numbers, you know, when we were freshmen in high school.
Yep. Pat, any memories for you? So we went through the leading passers. Terrell Davis of the Broncos led the league in rushing, 2,008 yards. I do remember that chase for 2,000 was a big deal. 1998. I don't know. I mean, that was Barry got there after that. I should probably know. What was it?
Previous year. So 97, Barry ran for over 2,000 yards. And I do remember I was annoyed that immediately after that, because it was such a huge deal for Barry to accomplish that 2,000 yard season. And then for Terrell Davis to get 2,000 yards, I was like, that's baloney. I don't want this.
I kind of do recall that now too.
Back here he is.
I think Zach makes a good point about the sort of media environment in the 90s, just sort of like building up these larger than life players, particularly quarterbacks. I mean, obviously it still is a quarterback centric league now, but they feel like guys come and go more quickly, or at least that the public perception is that it's like much more of a teams are the stars in the NFL versus individual players. But, you know, some of that might just be the benefit of hindsight. It's possible 20 years from now, we'll be talking about the great Jared Goff and his several Super Bowl victories if we're lucky.
Yeah, if we're lucky. Yeah. I mean, we probably don't appreciate Mahomes because he's just kind of annoying, but like, he's going to go down in history as one of the greatest ever. So we are in an era with like a dominant quarterback. So it's like there was a lot of guys then that were dominant, and then it kind of transitioned to basically a Brady Manning era where they dominated the league, and then that has given way to Mahomes. There was Rodgers in there too. But you'd think you'd like Elway and Marino, and you're coming off all those Cowboys championship teams where they were just by far the best team in the NFL for like a solid half decade. 49ers had a run in the 90s too. That was kind of coming to an end. Jerry Rice was still playing in 98. He had an incredibly long career, but was getting up there in age. Yeah, so it was, I do think there were a lot of stars, and I think your point is right. It's probably because we were teenagers, and that's kind of the time that's like cemented in your mind about who all these massive superstars were.
Yeah, and there was, you know, if you think about what video games you were playing, like Madden at that time was the best. I bet like NFL Blitz on 64 was coming out then, and you were just, you know, you were Steve Young to Jerry Rice all day.
Yeah. You know, I mean, the myth of Bo Jackson in the original Tecmo Bowl just shaped our opinions of Bo Jackson for decades. So I do think it's a good point that I was thinking, just the conversation about Mahomes and Rodgers. Like, I think the fact that I have memories of the end of Dan Marino and John Elway's careers, and they're like built up as these larger than life figures, but you don't like have the full history with them. I mean, Mahomes is kind of annoying in, I think, pretty harmless ways. Aaron Rodgers is just straight up annoying. Like, I just don't like the guy. So, like, I don't doubt his talent, but it's like, I don't really like to think about him as one of the larger than life figures of the NFL, despite his successful career
and Super Bowl.
Yeah, that's a theme with Green Bay Packers quarterbacks since Brett Favre was the exact same way.
Right.
He was a garbage human who won a lot of football games and media absolutely loved him.
Yeah, which is just super annoying. But again, I suppose if we were in our 30s in the 90s, we might have been more media aware. And I feel like there was like a whole thing when John Elway was drafted about where he like forced his way to Denver. I mean, I feel like those sorts of things would probably stick out for us in a way that when we're 14, we don't care. We're just like, these guys win, they throw touchdown passes. Jerry Rice is amazing. Yeah, Jerry Rice is still amazing. There's no shade to be thrown on that one, but some of it is probably just age cynicism as we get older, I guess. So let's talk a little bit about the 98 Vikings specifically and why I think they're pretty interesting. So they went 15-1 in the regular season. They had the first offense in the league. They scored 34.8 points per game. For a little context, that's like 2 points more per game than this year's leading offense, which was our Detroit Lions. So, like 25 years ago, 27 years ago, that's a ridiculous offense. They were also sixth in defense. So just a regular season juggernaut in every sense of the word. Despite that, they lose in the conference championship. They keep a lot of the core together over the years, but they never make a Super Bowl, despite having a really loaded roster and putting up numbers that are pretty outlandish at various times. So, with the Pistons, the last team we talked about, it was interesting because the way that team broke up sort of led directly to a title 5 years later. This team just sort of fades into NFL obscurity. And I think there's probably an interesting conversation about the way the NFL is structured in that everything is so reliant on winning the Super Bowl that a lot of these teams, if they don't get there, despite how great they might have been, you just don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. What do you guys remember specifically about, we'll start with you, Zach. Like, what do you remember specifically about the 98 team?
The 98 team, obviously the number one sort of topic there would be Randy Moss. But, along with it, they went 15-1, so they did have some other good players. They had Chris Carter, Hall of Famer, John Randall, Hall of Famer, Randy Moss, now a Hall of Famer. Gary Anderson, their kicker, is an all-time great kicker. I don't know if he's at the Hall of Fame. I probably should have looked that up, but he's an all-timer as well. Randall Cunningham, the quarterback for the team, he actually retired the previous year, and so he was not even in the NFL the year prior, and then came back to kind of unite with Chris Carter and was talked into it by the Vikings coach. So this was by no means a slouchy team. They had across the ball, both sides, they had Hall of Famers, great players.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a departure from the very mediocre team we focused on first, of the Pistons. But yeah, I mean, I think, to put a couple more numbers to it, they scored 34.8 points a game. Like I mentioned, they only gave up 18.5. I mean, they're just beating teams by 18 to 20 points every single week. Like if you look through their log, 1-7, 29-6, 41-7, 34-13, 24-3, they just weren't playing. I mean, obviously it's the NFL, so they had some close games in there, but truly a team that was week to week just crushing people. They beat our Lions 29-6 and 34-13. Not that beating the Lions in the 90s was like a major accomplishment week to week, but I do remember just feeling like, as a Lions fan, we're just not on their level, despite having Barry Sanders. I feel like it was like, well, we're watching to see if Barry will break a long one, but I'm not expecting this game to go well for us. Pat, what do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I know we're gonna get into Randy Moss specifically, but his influence as a rookie on the team made them feel kind of unstoppable. They had this they had weapons, Chris Carter, we talk about the guys on ESPN always used to say all he does is catch touchdowns. And so he had a big reputation for tons of touchdown catches, but it was really Randy Moss who came in and would just be, Randall Cunningham was just throwing it as far as he could, and Randy Moss would be 5 to 10 yards past the defense, just wide open, catching these bombs and bomb touchdowns, taking the top off the defense, where it just was like, well, what are you supposed to do? Like, you get this team in a situation where if they can get single coverage on this guy, Moss, it's a touchdown. And nobody in the NFL felt like they could keep up with him. Like maybe like Deion Sanders, or I don't even know who would have been the DB who could have stuck with Randy Moss. But as a Lions fan, we certainly didn't have anybody fast enough. None of our safeties or corners were keeping up with him. And there goes Moss again. He's faster than everybody else in the NFL.
Yeah, let's come back to Randy Moss here in a second, but just to kind of set the stage a little bit on who the players were. So Randall Cunningham, starts 15 games for them. Brad Johnson starts 2. So Randall Cunningham is their quarterback. I don't know if there were injury things or what accounted for those other 2 games, but he throws for 3,700 yards, 34 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. Like those are great numbers. It's incredible efficiency. He averaged 8.7 yards per attempt, which is a pretty ridiculous number. And I think it speaks to the talent. I just remember the offense. You mentioned Chris Carter and Randy Moss. They also had Robert Smith, who was a really underrated, talented back. He averaged 4.8 yards per carry that year, rushed for almost 1,200 yards. Like they're just really efficient all the way around on offense. And then, Randy Moss, 69 catches, 1,500 yards. Chris Carter, 78 catches, over 1,000 yards. Randy Moss, 17 touchdowns as a rookie is
still the rookie record in the NFL. That's the tied for the 6th most touchdowns in a season, receiving touchdowns still. So as a rookie, pretty impressive.
It's ridiculous.
So let's dig into Randy Moss a little bit more. Cause we'll talk maybe where he fits in the broader context, but I think his career is really interesting for a few reasons. Zach, you kind of did a little quick research of his college career, which I think if it played out in the modern age, there would be so many conversations about Randy Moss, but you want to run through some of that stuff?
Yeah. So, he was a Notre Dame fan, was basically enrolled there, and I might be getting some of the details off a little bit, but in high school, he got into a fight. I believe there was some racial charges, assigned to that fight. So maybe, whatever happened there. Got into a fight. Notre Dame blocked his enrollment, basically. He decides to transfer to Florida State. As part of that, at the time, you'd had to sit out a year. So he was going to redshirt that year at Florida State and then start at Florida State. As part of that fight, he has to serve part of a jail sentence, does that, but also then tests positive for marijuana, sometime within that time frame. So Florida State then releases him. After that happens, he transfers to Marshall, which is a division, I guess, be Division II or 1AA, however they called it back then. And because it was going from Florida State to Marshall, he didn't have to sit out a year. So that, I guess it'd be that red shirt sophomore year or red shirt freshman year, because he played 2 years at Marshall, I believe, was able to play and do some really sort of ridiculous things at Marshall.
I didn't look up his stats. Oh, was he just dominant?
It's really ridiculous, especially his last year at Marshall. It's just obscene.
Yeah, so that 1997 season, he has 90 catches for 1,647 yards. That's 18 yards per reception, 25 touchdowns. I feel like he also returned punts. Go for it.
Including the bowl game, he had 1,820 yards and 26 touchdowns. Just preposterous. He had 266 punt return yards and 263 kick return yards. So he was doing punt returns, kick returns, was, mossing people, as it were.
Yeah, it's not an exact comparison, because Marshall is not like quite as obscure, but feels like his story is like perfect for Last Chance U, that documentary series where they go to the like small time football programs that bring in all the guys who like get booted from major programs. I didn't realize that that it was Notre Dame, then FSU, then that's how he landed at Marshall. I guess I didn't remember that story.
He did 2 years at Marshall, or played 2 years at Marshall, tallied over 3,500 yards receiving in those 2 years and 54 touchdowns. It's just really ridiculous.
Yeah, so then he comes to the Vikings, and I think has what I would consider the greatest rookie wide receiver season ever. There's been some other good ones, but he was instantly just like unstoppable, uncoverable, and touchdowns. I think led the league that year. Like their offense was the best in the league. Yeah, they had Chris Carter to like do the tough over the middle catches and the third down stuff, but Moss was the guy who like made their offense so explosive.
Yeah, and sort of coupled with that, you obviously have this great player, maybe not obviously playing at Marshall, maybe not getting as much screen time, but NFL teams are going to find good players. You know, the NFL draft that year, he goes first. Plenty of players taken before him that we have heard of, including Charles Woodson was taken 4th overall, I believe. In my opinion, Moss should have won the Heisman that year. He had as many punt return yards as Woodson. He had way more kick return yards because Woodson didn't return kicks. Woodson only had 7 touchdowns. Moss had 26 touchdowns. Woodson had 7 interceptions. Major difference there. I digress. That NFL draft that year was also the Manning Ryan Leaf NFL draft. But yeah, just sort of what a gift the Vikings were given to be able to take him 20.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Marshall thing probably played into the him falling to 21. You know, there's all this conversation of like, well, he's dominating at a mid-major level. Like, what's he going to be like in the NFL? There are, you know, whatever character concerns that people were assigning to players back then. I think that's all part of it. I mean, I do remember that playing at Marshall was definitely part of that Heisman debate. It definitely felt like it was held against him going into the draft, much to the Vikings' benefit and the rest of the league's detriment, because as soon as he stepped on the field, it's like, oh yeah, this guy wasn't just dominating. He didn't look like an elite athlete because he was playing against lesser competition. He looked like an elite athlete because he's an elite athlete, like no matter who his competition is.
Yeah, and Chad Pennington was his quarterback at Marshall. Sorry to jump on you there, Pat, but like no one's you know having parades for Chad Pennington. You know, you gotta if you're Randy Moss, you're catching balls from anyone.
Chad Pennington might still be the most successful Jets quarterback in the interim period.
That's incredible.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, the way he came from Marshall and had such instant success as a first overall pick. Also, it kind of fits with, like, this team kind of came out of nowhere a little bit. Like, Randall Cunningham had a great career with the Eagles. Like Zach said, had retired, had injury issues, retired. But his career with the Eagles, he was a dual threat, like one of the first major dual threats in the NFL. I think he rushed for nearly 1,000 yards in a season. In his like mid-20s, he would, you know, have over 100 carries a couple seasons. So he comes back to the Vikings. He's 35 years old, and he only has 32 rush attempts, 132 yards. So like totally transformed out of being a dual threat guy to being this like downfield passer. He always had a huge arm. So Randy Moss and him were a good connection there. And you guys mentioned Robert Smith. I always remember him as this long, striding running back who also had elite speed, so he could get the edge. So they could threaten the edge against linebackers and safeties to make them really, you know, I don't think Robert Smith was going to be like the guy to make people miss. He's kind of the opposite as a running back of Barry Sanders. Where, like, if you put him in a hole, he's not going to, like, juke a linebacker out of his shoes. But if you have him try to take an angle on him to the sideline, he's going to beat him more often than not because he had such big speed. So that's just a weapon at your disposal. And this team, I didn't remember this until doing a little research, but their offensive coordinator was Brian Billick, who ended up going on and being a Super Bowl head coach for the Baltimore Ravens. So obviously, coached this team, had this incredible offense that led the league that he parlayed into a head coaching job for himself.
Yeah, Pat, I actually want to chat about that a little bit. Brian Billick, not someone I ever thought of as an offensive-minded coach. Those Ravens teams were always like they were the greatest defense for like 9 straight years. They were just incredible on defense. I don't have a lot of Brian Billick stats to spout off the top of my head. But you think this is just he's obviously a great coach. He has all this talent around him. He can do kind of whatever. I never thought of him as an offensive coordinator. Didn't dawn on me,
When they won the Super Bowl with Trent Dilfer, obviously it was like, we're going to control the game with our defense, not turn it over. But that is what makes a good football coach, right? Being able to figure out your personnel and optimize your team for winning. So like this Vikings team, Kenny mentioned a couple of their standouts on defense. I don't remember them as being a great defense. I think their stats show that they were pretty good this year in 98 on defense, but I remember their offense. They just like, that's what felt like you were just like being overwhelmed by their speed, their talent, everything about them. And Randall Cunningham having such a great season, I don't remember enough to know, like, was he just making pinpoint balls on third down, or were they just not getting into third down because they had already bombed a 60-yard touchdown, or, something that it was just so easy for them. Guys were so open that he was kind of able to have all this success.
Yeah, it's a little hard. Like, one thing about the NFL is, I feel like compared to basketball, like the stats don't tell the story quite as well. And without really being able to look back into our memories and remember the games, I don't remember exactly like what the recipe for success was, other than Randy Moss just being this transcendent threat. I mean, they had other great players, don't get me wrong, but to kind of get back to Randy Moss before we talk a little bit more about those players, their other players, he's definitely the first wide receiver I can remember where it's just like, he's not ever really covered. Like, even if there is a guy running stride for stride with him, it did not matter, right? Like, if you put a ball high and in his reach, he could go get it. And, we talked a little bit as we were kind of getting ready for this, that some of this is maybe the limitation of our memory, but is as great as, and Jerry Rice is still the greatest receiver of all time in terms of everything he was able to do. And he could certainly make those contested catches, but he wasn't 6'3" or whatever Randy Moss was. And this just felt like the evolution of the wide receiver position. There had obviously been big wide receivers before. One of our favorites, Herman Moore, was sort of that way in the red zone for the Lions, where, you could throw the ball up to him, but he didn't have that speed, that combination of speed where he could also take a slant and just all of a sudden he's blowing by the defense and scoring a touchdown that way either, right? Like, that combination of size and speed was unique in my mind in the NFL when Randy Moss came along. I mean, Joe Burrow now had that quote talking about playing with Jamar Chase where he's just like, F it, Jamar's down there somewhere. And like, and I feel like that was the original Randy Moss. And it led to sort of that prototype coming into the NFL. Again, to kind of circle back to our Lions fandom, Calvin Johnson was like the next evolution of this, where it's like, he's the biggest guy on the field and the fastest guy. And it's just like, what do you do with that? And I feel a little jealous of all the 14-year-old Viking fans getting to root for that, because I know it was really fun to root for Calvin as an adult. So yeah, Randy Moss, just an incredible player. I think we'll talk a little bit more about kind of some of the other parts of his career. He played several seasons with the Vikings. He put up good numbers, gets traded to the Raiders, puts up fairly pedestrian numbers. He battles some injuries and then gets traded again to the Patriots and is on yet another like absolutely transcendent offense with Tom Brady. So a really fascinating career. We'll talk, at the end, we can kind of put it into some more historical context. But we talked a little bit about Robert Smith. The other guy that we haven't spent quite as much time on is Chris Carter, a Hall of Famer in his own right. I mentioned his stats, like almost 90 catches. I also have memories of him sort of being, like, I don't think in the 90s anybody was going to really debate who the best receiver in the league was. It was Jerry Rice. But Chris Carter felt like he was right there with Michael Irvin and, other guys like that as sort of that next tier of just like extremely reliable. Maybe that's not even doing him justice. He was a great player in his own right. And sort of that combination of this transcendent athlete, wide receiver in Randy Moss with a veteran who for most of his career had been a true number one, just led to an offense that could beat you in essentially anywhere.
Yeah, Chris Carter, obviously no slouch, a Hall of Famer. Also an 8-time Pro Bowler, went to 8 straight, as a matter of fact. Those years he averaged, about, I want to say 1,100 yards, 1,200 yards, 11 touchdowns a season. Like, those are just incredible numbers to have for such a long period of time. What a what a sort of ridiculous 1-2 combo that is to have Randy Moss and Chris Carter, more or less peak Chris Carter, because he was peak for so long, on the same offense, catching balls. That's just so silly.
I didn't realize until doing the research on this that Randall Cunningham and Chris Carter were teammates on the Eagles.
Yeah, he was playing in...
Yeah. And then they both joined the Vikings later in their career. I didn't. I guess
playing on the late 80s.
That I didn't remember Chris Carter's career other than from when he started playing against the Lions in the NFC North, and was super annoying. All he does is catch touchdowns, and the Lions lose again. And
right, exactly.
But he was obviously really good. And he was. I think you mentioned like the best receivers in the 90s. I think it was Jerry Rice, Michael Irvin, and Chris Carter. I might be missing somebody, but those three guys were all really good and had longevity. You kind of talked about Moss. He was kind of what you would imagine if you combined maybe a Michael Irvin and a Jerry Rice into one player. He was always thinner, and like he was not the physical, like imposing strength guy like Calvin Johnson was when he came into the league, but he could leap like a basketball player going up for dunks. And so they'd throw it up to him and he'd out-leap people. I'm back to Randy Moss because it's just so much on my mind. But yeah, Chris Carter and Cunningham, started their career, I think played a few years together with the Eagles, then separated, and then Randall Cunningham comes to the Vikings, and they have this immediate success in this 98. It was short-lived for them together with the Vikings, but pretty special season.
Yeah, the NFL always stud the all-decades teams, like 80s, aughts, that sort of thing. And first team all-decade wide receivers are Jerry Rice and Chris Carter. Second team are Michael Irvin and Tim Brown.
Oh, Tim Brown, yeah.
Tim Brown's a great player, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is an interesting discussion. Are Randy Moss and Chris Carter the best wide receiver duo in this 98 season in NFL history?
That is an incredible question to spring on us right now, Pat.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty interesting. Like, so their stats, they combined for 2,324 yards and 29 touchdowns. And obviously the highest scoring offense in NFL history at the time. Just a couple years later, you had Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce with the Rams.
I was going to say Yep.
They combined for 3,100 yards, but only 15 TDs. So you can kind of have that discussion about yardage versus touchdowns. Jerry Rice and John Taylor, who was kind of Jerry's wingman with the 49ers. In 89, they had 2,600 yards and 27 TDs. It's a lot of touchdowns. And
what about Jerry Rice's other partner, Terrell Owens?
Yeah, but at that point, wasn't Rice like pretty at the end of his career? He was kind of. I don't think he was dominant. Yeah,
that's my recollection. My gut is probably. I don't know. You could probably certainly of our memory. I think I'm trying to think. I'm sure there's probably some guys from like the 70s or 80s that I don't remember that well. The other duo that comes to mind is Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne with those Colts teams were really good. And
there's a few other more recent ones, also including Randy Moss with Wes Welker on the 07 Patriots. Those guys were really good. They combined for 2,700 yards and 31 touchdowns. Also pretty recent, Antonio Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster. Those guys had like over 200 receptions and 2,700 yards, 22 TDs.
I don't know if anybody's going to be telling their kids about the Juju Smith-Schuster, Antonio Brown.
Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden, I remember, with the Cardinals.
It's a good one.
Really good together.
One thing, since this is a good kind of impromptu question, one thing I think that, like, in my mind kind of helps cement the case for Randy Moss and Chris Carter is, we talked about how good of a year Randall Cunningham had, and he was a nice NFL player, right? But like, you think about Jerry Rice and John Taylor are playing with Joe Montana. Jerry Rice and Terrell Owens are playing with Steve Young. Randy Moss and Wes Welker are playing with Tom Brady. So the fact that this duo kind of stands out with not Hall of Fame quarterback play, I think is probably an argument for them, because I just, like, in my mind, it was really their talent that elevated that offense more than Randall Cunningham. Maybe that's a little bit unfair to him. I mean, he obviously was in the right system. They used him correctly. He made the throws, but he was a very good longtime NFL QB, but he's not on the level of some of those other guys.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that when you watched these 98 Vikings, you felt like they were uncoverable. Like, just what are you going to do if you put your cornerback number 2 and try to single cover Chris Carter, if you don't have a safety playing super deep over the top of Randy Moss on every down, you are toast. And so you have to just pick, like, how are we going to be super vulnerable? And the Vikings could attack that vulnerability. They had, if you try to drop too many guys, they had a good offensive line, and they're just going to run the ball then.
Yeah, and you talked about Robert Smith being the exact sort of right back, where if you're playing with like a lighter box and you're not perfect in your assignments, he's explosive enough that he's really going to make you pay for that. Like, even if he's not going to win a lot of downs just like on his own, he's fast enough and had that burst that could make you pay for not being perfect on that side. So yeah, I mean, the offense was incredible. 15-1 was, at that point, no team had been better than that. I think there had been one other 15-1 team prior in the 16 game seasons, if I remember correctly from my research. Despite that, they get to the playoffs. They get a first round bye. They win that first divisional game relatively easily, and then they lose in the NFC Championship game to, frankly, a team that could be another candidate for this pod, the 1998 Atlanta Falcons, who are 16-2 by the time they get to the Super Bowl, which before doing a little bit of research here, I'm not sure I could have named a single player on the 1998 Atlanta Falcons. I mean, I do remember, once I looked at some stats from that game, Jamal Anderson had a really good year at running back. They go on to lose to the Denver Broncos, and John Elway in his second Super Bowl, he then retires. Pat, you talked a little bit about how specifically that game ended. Do you want to run through that? Some excellent schadenfreude for us Lions fans.
Yes. Quick Jamal Anderson aside, I remember watching, might have been before this playoff game, like on Fox or something. They had a promo with Jamal Anderson, and it was about how enormous his thighs were, that he had to have custom pants so they could fit over his thighs, and then they'd be able to like cinch them onto his waist because his thighs were so big, which is incredible. Yeah, so the NFC Championship game, I mean, I think Vikings fans would it's probably seared into their memory. It wasn't seared into my memory because I didn't care. I was probably rooting for the Vikings to lose. They lost in overtime 30-27, and they had a chance to win it in regulation, and Gary Anderson missed a 38-yard field goal, which we've seen kickers miss, relatively short makeable field goals in high pressure situations, but it was probably extra painful for Vikings fans because Gary Anderson had been perfect the entire season. He was 35 for 35 on field goals and 59 for 59 on extra points. And his only miss was to win the game in the NFC Championship. I cannot imagine the pain that I'm sure Vikings fans, if any Vikings fans listen to this, I'm sure they're probably need some bourbon or something after the pod.
Yeah, it's not a lost team for them. It's a painful team. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I was going to agree with Pat. Just the Jamal Anderson, I specifically remember his having massive thighs. But yeah, he's the only person I remember from that team outside of the Dirty Bird. There's no reason to remember them because they didn't win the Super Bowl, right? Like that's That's kind of the nature of this. Do want to just make a quick point that Morton Anderson was the kicker for the Atlanta Falcons, a great Spartan, Morton Anderson. Go Green.
So, yeah, you would have been cheering for the Falcons undoubtedly, even though you were several years from enrolling in at Michigan State. Preemptively, you were ready for it. Let's just go a little bit through the Vikings as a franchise. In 1997, so the year before we talked about this team, they were 9-7. And then they were 11th in offense. Looking through, they had a lot of the same guys. Their starting quarterback that year for most of the year was Brad Johnson. Randall Cunningham played in 6 games. They still had Robert Smith. They still had Chris Carter. Yeah, 11th, perfectly good in offense. They draft Randy Moss and they go to first. I mean, I think that's just maybe another data point into exactly how dominant he was and what he did specifically for their offense as a rookie. So just wild. Randy Moss, man, great player. So 98, the season we just talked about, they go 15-1. As we talked about, they lose in the NFC Championship game. The next season, they go 10-6 for reasons that I don't fully remember. They switched quarterbacks partway through the year from Randall Cunningham to Jeff George, Jeff George, I remember as the guy that NFL analysts and announcers were always like, this is the guy that if he ever puts it all together could be the next great quarterback because he had just the cannon arm and he could make all the throws. Spoiler alert, Jeff George, I don't think ever really fully put it together. Again, he had a long NFL career, but I don't think ever reached that potential. The year after that, they go 11-5, again, make the NFC Championship game. This time they don't lose on a last second field goal. They lose 41-0 to the New York Giants. And Dennis Green resigns, but we're looking at the news coverage. It seems like the owners were getting ready to fire him. Whatever happens, he's no longer their coach. We should probably talk a little bit about Dennis Green. Just a really solid NFL coach. He had that famous rant after they lost in a game that he felt like they should win, where he was like, you guys want to talk about crowning them? They are who we thought they are, or whatever that Dennis Green rant was. But he really long head coaching career, 97-62. That's a 610 winning percentage. So yeah, his Vikings record, his worst season as head coach of the Vikings was 8-8. So man, I guess there's something in there about be careful for moving on from a coach that you've had a lot of success with, because they let him go, and the next season they go 5-11, and Mike Tice is the coach, and they never come remotely close to reaching that level of success again. I think he has a couple 8-8, 9-7 type seasons, and then they eventually trade Randy Moss to the Raiders, and that particular era of Vikings football is kind of over. I mean, I kind of remember that, again, when you've still got Randy Moss, I think you're probably going to have a pretty good offense. I remember some fun Dante Culpepper years, but they were just never real contenders after letting Dennis Green go.
Yeah, it's sort of looking at the last 30-ish years of Vikings history, just sort of a weird win-loss cycle that they have. They'll go 11-5 or whatever it might be, and then the next year there's 8-7, and then they're 8-7 for 4 straight years, then boom, 14 wins, that sort of thing. As a Lions fan, I've never experienced anything like that. It's kind of like 2-14 and for 7 straight years. So I'm hoping that we don't have a cycle like that with our current Lions.
See, folks, we're 2 podcasts in, and that's what they call a segue in the business, because one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this team is we think there are some really interesting comparisons to our beloved Lions, the era that we are in currently, right down to the Lions just won 15 games behind a really dominant offense. And, even the year before that, the Lions lost in the NFC Championship game in heartbreaking fashion. And, I think in recognition of how the NFL works, Dan Campbell, who has nothing but apologists on this pod, he even said after the game, he was like, I want the team to realize how meaningful this is, because we might not get back here, right? Like he said, I think we will. Like, I think we're good enough to, but you just never know in the NFL. I mean, I'm sure in 1998 with a rookie Randy Moss, the Vikings are like, hey, we lost in the NFC title game, but the future is bright, and things never got that close again, despite the other NFC title game appearance. So, Pat, you want to talk a little bit about maybe some like actual roster similarities between the Vikings and the Lions, and then we can chat a little bit about big picture stuff for the Lions and why things hopefully will be different for us this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few very glaring similarities. The 98 Vikings lead the NFL in scoring, just like the Lions did this past season. Lions are trying to build up their defense, but it's clearly behind the offense. So they have to win games by outscoring people. Hopefully that changes for the Lions, like you're saying, and that's how they can get over the hump. But it's never guaranteed that you're going to just keep having a dominant offense. This Vikings team had Randall Cunningham kind of having a career resurgence. There's a little bit of that with Jared Goff, started with the Rams and then came over to Detroit. I think there's just in kind of the personnel and the way that they play is kind of similar. I'm not saying Jameson Williams is equivalent to Randy Moss, but he is undoubtedly one of the fastest players on the field when he plays, and he gives the Lions offense that deep downfield, take the top off a defense threat that kind of opens things up underneath, that Amon-Ra can operate in that space just like Chris Carter did. They're different players. Amon-Ra more of a jitterbug, and Chris Carter, could kind of go up and make those tough catches. I'm not trying to downplay Sun God. He'll do that too. He's just not as big of a threat, like a big of a guy. And even there's a comparison, I think, at running back, like the threat that Gibbs creates for the Lions, threatening the edge, is just like what Robert Smith gave the Vikings. And Randall Cunningham, I think of him as this dual threat guy, but on that Vikings team, he wasn't doing that. So they were still operating under, we got to protect him, we got to get the ball out, just like the Lions are with Goff. You give them time and you let those playmakers get open. So yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities. The one thing about the Lions is they do feel a little younger, just overall. They've got a lot of recent draft picks. It's not like this one superstar and then some older guys, coming together to kind of lead them. So hopefully we have a longer window and can, build the team up.
Yeah, I guess when you kind of say it, it's like when you start talking about the teams that have the best offenses in the league, I think they're going to tend to be teams that can threaten you both with the run and the pass. And so I do hope, selfishly, I hope that the way the Lions have built, where like Gibbs is a great player, but Monty is also extremely efficient. It feels like they are really built with great skill players, but also with that talent on the offensive line that hopefully will really be able to sustain them. I looked at the Vikings O-line, and they did have a couple of Pro Bowlers. Todd Stussy played left tackle. I do remember that name as him being, like one of the better left tackles that folks would talk about on broadcast. That's, the extent of my memories. But it does feel like the Lions are built with Penne, who, is not just a Pro Bowler. He might be the best tackle in the NFL. And to your point, he's young. He plays with sort of that attitude that feels like it's sustainable. So hopefully things turn out differently for the Lions. But, Zach, what do you think about that comparison and, what it means for the Lions moving forward?
Yeah, I think the comparison is fair. It's not something that's a silly thing to say or anything like that. The teams they have a lot of similarities, as Pat laid out. But I think the biggest difference Pat also mentioned is the age. These Lions are a lot younger than those Vikings were. That Vikings team also had another Hall of Famer in Randall McDaniel, who was the left guard. He only played maybe 2 more years in the NFL after that 98 season. That was kind of the end of his career. While a lot of our offensive line folks are younger. I think Taylor Decker might be the oldest starter on the offensive line. So our window should be just opening now, where that Vikings caught sort of some fire in the, not flash in the pan, that's probably not the right word, but, they they were able to add Moss, and just suddenly they had something that they could cook with immediately.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it certainly feels like the Lions are built for success, at least in the next couple of years. I can't say that I remember what the cap era was and how all those ramifications worked in 1998. I feel like the Lions are going to be faced with having to manage some of that in the next few years, but at least in the next couple of years, they've got all of their key guys locked up. So I'm optimistic. I think they've got the right coach, and it would be hard to imagine that if the Lions were to have an 11-5 year this year and a disappointing loss in the playoffs, that ownership would make a change, given the history of the franchise. So I feel like, that is another thing that's a little different. Dennis Green had been with them for close to a decade at that point, and they probably just felt like they needed a new voice, whereas Dan Campbell clearly is not going anywhere anytime soon, barring something strange happening. But I think it's just a reminder that it's really hard to have a dynasty in the NFL. Like, the league is just set up for there to be change, and things can be fleeting. So, hopefully we can appreciate where the Lions are at. It's easy for us to appreciate where they're at now from where they've come, because, man, things were bleak for a very long time.
Yeah, I think one other comparison between the teams is at the coordinator level. So we talked about Brian Billick a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see how Dan is able to, this 98 team, number one offense, that got Brian Billick. He took over for Baltimore in 99. So Ben Johnson leaving Detroit, sometimes it can be, we talk about the personnel on the team, but sometimes it can be the vibes and the way a staff comes together and works. People, maybe there's rising talent, and even if as Lions fans, we are hoping that it was primarily Dan Campbell. There's some evidence that Ben Johnson could be a star, and losing him could be a big loss. So when you look at Billick won the Super Bowl in 2000, he had immediate success as second season. So God, hopefully that doesn't happen. And Ben Johnson,
you're gonna.
My God, no, thank you.
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, there's the discussion, right? And I think that we can have that with this Vikings team and the Lions. Is how much of the coordinator's success is due to their scheme and their coaching ability, and how much is due to the personnel. So people love to say, Jimmys and Joes are X's and O's. And obviously it's some combination with this Lions team. Hopefully, they can find another coordinator that can come in and mesh with these guys and continue the success that they've had. Obviously the Vikings couldn't. They couldn't keep it up.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Any other big picture thoughts we want to talk about with this team or the NFL from that era in general?
I think that it's interesting that Randy Moss was on two of the best ever teams that didn't win a Super Bowl. This 98 Vikings team, 15-1, and then the 2007 Patriots that obviously, were everybody thought the greatest team ever, and then they lose in the Super Bowl. So,
yeah. And I mean, I think this most recent iteration of the Lions was sort of in that conversation too. They didn't make the Super Bowl. They didn't even make the NFC title game. I mean, I think as Lions fans, I think the injuries on the defense played a huge part in that. But that's also sort of the nature of the NFL, is that you have to both be good and get relatively good injury luck, because injuries are going to be inevitable in the league, but for the Lions to be so decimated all on one side of the ball, and in particular in the front seven, was just, there's not much. It's tough to overcome that. But if you look pre-injury, the Lions were sort of on a similar pace in terms of those games. A lot of their games this past year weren't even close. They were just clearly better than teams on both sides of the ball. But yeah, I don't know. It is pretty remarkable. Again, it makes sense, because Randy Moss is a great player, that he would play on teams with great offenses, but for him to be literally on two of those best regular season teams is pretty unique.
Yeah. I think that's the point. It's the thing that he gave you on offense is kind of a high variance play. He has to spring a huge long touchdown. That was kind of his value was these like bomb passes. And just by nature, like you can only have so many of those. Teams are going to adjust. They're going to shut that down. And then like, so it's interesting how dominant he felt, but yet it shows that like it's a variance thing where you could get got. Like it's not like just a dominant offensive line that can just, you know, oh, we can get 5 yards anytime we want. And that is actually more inevitable, I think, than like the best receiver. Like I personally, for me, Randy Moss is my GOAT just because I always felt like Jerry Rice was really good, but he wasn't like it was like longevity and his like work. He was just a workhorse and he would catch everything, but he didn't feel like he just dominated you. And like you mentioned, he had great quarterbacks. So like the statistical comparison, he's amazing. But Randy Moss felt like he was just more like physically better than everybody. But I think it does kind of show the limitations just of how impactful and important a wide receiver can be. Like they can elevate you into the best offense in the league, but you still got to be able to win down to down in the trenches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And I guess that's a reason for us to, again, feel like the Lions are built to do that, right? I mean, they have great wide receiver talent, but they're clearly built with the goal of being able to win those tough yards. So, you know, hopefully that's sustainable for them going forward.
So I had one more question I wanted to ask you guys. So I just said Randy Moss is my GOAT. None of us are Vikings fans. Obviously, we're all Lions guys. But do you think, is Randy Moss a Vikings fan GOAT wide receiver, or is it Chris Carter? Because one guy was there like 6-7 years, and then Chris Carter was there like over a decade, right? Like Zach said, he was the player of the decade or the top 2 wide receiver of the decade. It'd be interesting. It's an interesting thing. Like we kind of touched on this with our Pistons podcast about Grant Hill, his place in the like league history versus Pistons history, because you only have part of your career with that team. I wonder if Vikings fans would say it's Chris Carter, who's the greatest Viking wide receiver.
I think real, true Vikings fans would say that it's Chris Carter. He was there for so long. I think if you looked at any list, it'd be Chris Carter as well. I'm sure some more recent ones might be, Adam Thielen appreciators or whatever it might be, but it's got to be Chris Carter, right?
Yeah, I mean, from a longevity with the team perspective, probably. I guess it's an interesting conversation. You mentioned Grant. For those listening, if you haven't, go check out our podcast about the 99 Pistons. So much of, I think, fandom is caught up in what does the team end up accomplishing, right? So, I think if you just lined up the first 7 years of Grant Hill's career, he'd rank pretty high on the list in terms of all-time Pistons greats. But if you start asking me to think about who are my Pistons GOATs, he's probably farther down that because they never win the title, right? I mean, Isaiah, Dumars, Rodman are guys that we don't really remember, but that because of how incredible those bad boy teams were, and then the going to work Pistons, that entire starting five, and they, even aside from the individual title, the 8-year run or whatever that they had of team success, and think about the Red Wings, it's like you think about Yzerman and Fedorov and Lidstrom, and they were both great players, and they brought the Wings Stanley Cups, and in the case of the Wings, they did it at a time when we were teenagers, and it was just like, yeah, these guys are just the best. I still have a picture of Steve Yzerman hanging in my house. Maybe Alexis could take notes, Zach.
Yeah. There you go.
But, for the Vikings, though, what I was going to say is, not to throw stones at them, because the Lions are in the same boat, but they've never won the Super Bowl, right? So, in terms of team success, this 15-1 team is probably their peak. They've made a couple other NFC championship games. The one I referenced earlier against the Giants, they've had a couple of other close calls, but they don't have, there's nobody that they can point to say, that brought us a title, so that's our guy. For us, yeah. Lion fans, we're in a little bit of a similar boat where it's easy for us to be like, well, Kelvin and Barry are the two transcendent offensive players that we got to watch, that at various times were just clearly the best or second best player in the league at their position or on offense in general. But if Jared Goff wins us a Super Bowl next year with Penne and ASB, those guys are climbing up my personal GOAT rankings just for like bringing us that joy. So it's an interesting question. Hopefully we can get a couple Viking fans to listen to this and, send us a message or whatever.
Yeah. And then my last question is, I couldn't think of any, but is there anybody else whose name has been turned into a verb? You got mossed, like that show. I mean, I feel like that shows just how special he was, right? Like that every NFL fan knows exactly what that means just because he was so dominant.
Yeah, it's not the same level, but because hockey's so niche. But when Cronwall was doing it for the Red Wings, people would say someone got Cronwalled when he would just like obliterate somebody.
That's a good one.
But I don't know. I can't think of any.
I was going to say the only other one I could think of is, it's not even a name, but the Michigan is a play in hockey where you do the, behind the goal score, the lift it up into the top shelf there.
That's true.
But, also niche hockey.
Yeah. And none of us could actually tell you what Michigan player did that. Maybe Pat could.
Yeah.
It's in my brain somewhere, but I don't remember the top of my head.
All right. Well, I don't know. Anything else we need to say about that? We're entering March Madness. Best of luck to our Spartans, Zach. Worst of luck to your Wolverines.
That's what I'm talking about.
I mean, we can both have success for a few games and then face each other. That'd be fun.
No, that wouldn't. That'd be hell. That'd be pure hell.
I don't know. The state of Michigan would be. It's easy for Pat, like out in Hawaii, thousands of miles removed from walking around the office. It's just there's a lot of stress that goes into.
I only have to deal with you yahoos texting me. That's my only
the text thread during a Michigan State tournament game would not be PG. Let's just say that for listeners.
Yeah. Speaking of verbs.
All right. Well, guys, this was fun. Again, we'll try to do one maybe a little more quickly than the last one. But yeah, for folks, check us out. Now that I have a little bit more technical sophistication, available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So yeah, this was another episode of the Darko Ages. We'll talk to you all later.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
That's right.
Love it.
See you guys.